Okay, we're going to finish up our lectures today covering Daniel, Ezra-Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So let's get going. Um, the book of Daniel is a unified book. It's one book. It's not a collection of books. It's one book written in two languages, both Hebrew and Aramaic. It transitions in chapter 4 when the king is speaking. So we have two books. Um, Aramaic is found in these chapters, and then it transitions back to Hebrew, which is very, very interesting. The book of Ezra does something very, very similar when it comes to Cyrus's decree. It's in Aramaic, and then it transitions back to Hebrew. On the one hand, the book is historical. There are historical stories about it and narrative, but it's also apocalyptic in that it's envisioning a distant future and using symbols to communicate that future. Notice that the genres, historical narrative in 1 through 6, are both in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the apocalypse is in both Hebrew and Aramaic as well. So it's not neatly divided. And what that shows us is that this book is a unity. It's not two different books brought together as one, but it's one book. We have different authorial perspectives. Nebuchadnezzar is spoken about in the first person earlier on when there's direct speech, but Daniel is speaking in the first person in direct speech, starting in chapter 7. Here are the 6 famous narratives that we learn about in the book of Daniel. Daniel and his friends in the courts, Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, a golden image, Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, judgment on Belshazzar, and then Daniel in the lion's den. The story begins with a test. We're introduced to some Jewish youth in the Babylonian courts where the officials are feeding all of the young men food sacrificed to idols and food that's not permissible for Daniel. So Daniel has wisdom and asks that they wouldn't eat it, and it turns out that they're actually healthier than the other youth. A problem arises when Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that none of the wise men can interpret. In fact, the king wants to ensure that the wise men know what they're talking about, so he makes them tell him the dream and its interpretation. Daniel learns about this as a wise man in the court. The death sentence is on him as well, and he turns to God and prays for wisdom, and God gives him wisdom to interpret the dream. Here we have the plot, namely the problem, the solution, and outcome, and the verdict. So in this sense, the book is very much like a historical narrative. Here's Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel is able to interpret. Again, a problem, solution, outcome, and a verdict. Here we have another problem that arises, not so much with now it's progressed from the food to a dream to Nebuchadnezzar requiring everybody to worship his statue, which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 Israelite youth, refuse to bow down. That's the problem. The solution is that the Lord saves them. And then the king glorifies the Lord for it. And that's what we're seeing in Daniel, is that, God's people were exiled because of their sin. But here in exile, we see this picture of righteous Israelites who, by their righteousness, actually move foreign kings to praise God because of their righteousness. Let's see, we have the second dream now, where at this point Nebuchadnezzar knows Daniel, but he still has actually a very scary dream. And again, Daniel is able to interpret it. In this dream, Daniel interprets that Nebuchadnezzar will become like an ox eating the grass outside. Daniel interprets this dream. The outcome again is that Nebuchadnezzar glorifies the Lord because of Daniel's life. The fifth narrative is about Belshazzar, who defiles the temple vessels. So he brings the cups of the temple, and he's basically having a drunken party with them. And Daniel, um, um, a hand appears and writes on the wall in a language nobody can interpret. So they call Daniel in, and Daniel reads the inscription, and inscription is referring to the destruction of the Babylonians. And again, we have a problem solution, and it ends with this idea that Yahweh, it does control everything. So we learned about how Yahweh controls the health of Daniel and his friends in the very beginning with the food they're eating. God controls the knowledge of dreams and their interpretation. That was the second story. God controls his people and protects them even from flames. God can control and interpret Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, and God controls all things, which is validated with Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall, because very shortly after, the Babylonian kingdom is destroyed by the Medes and Persians. The lion's den, this is actually referring to the Persians. This is no longer referring to the Babylonians. This is now referring to the Persians, where Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. So at this age, he's actually quite old. And again, this being the last narrative, we see the outcome is that the Lord is glorified, and the truth that God controls all things. This is very important, because when God's people were exiled and kicked out of their land and marched to Babylon, they saw statues of Marduk and Babylonian king gods. And the thought is were we exiled because our God is weak? Were we exiled because their God is stronger? And what we're seeing in the book of Esther, but also Daniel and Lamentations, and all of these books written during the exile and after it, is we learn that God controls all things. And that's the resounding theme we see through these narratives, that God is controlling all of these things. And that's the point, that the Lord is to be glorified in all places, in Babylon, in Persia, everywhere, because he controls all things. And that moves us from the narrative section, all about God's control, to the apocalypse. And so here we're learning that Daniel is moving from interpreting events that are happening in his time, like Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. He's interpreting them, and Nebuchadnezzar could say that's right or it's wrong. And we're learning that Daniel is trustworthy. He's talking about events in his own lifetime. But then in Daniel 7 through 14, we learn about Daniel talking about very, very distant events that refer to Jesus' first coming and second coming. And the author is supposed to trust Daniel because he's verifiably a honest, trustworthy prophet. So we should trust him with the latter chapters as well. And that's the point, is that God controls the ideas and the circumstances of the Babylonian kingdom and the Persian kingdom, and he also will control the events of the end of the world as well. The genre here is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic, as I've already mentioned, is talking about distant events with signs and symbols. So Peter Gentry describes it this way: if you were to walk into an Amazon jungle and interact with a people group who have no interaction with the outside world, and they saw you on your iPhone, how would you describe your iPhone? Well, you probably wouldn't describe it in terms of binary math and coding. Rather, what you would do is you would describe your iPhone in terms that they understand. You would use signs and symbols that they get to describe what's happening with an iPhone. And that's how Daniel 7 through 14 is what it's doing. It's talking about very distant events using the signs and symbols that Daniel's audience in the 6th century BC would get. Now, the purpose of all of this is to encourage faithfulness in hard times. So as God's people reflect on how God has been faithful to Daniel, to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how he's been faithful to his people, it's supposed to breed confidence that he will be faithful to us in the future. Let's see. That's probably good for Daniel. Let's move on to Ezra-Nehemiah. These books are actually one book in the Hebrew order, but often we refer to them as two. These are exilic and post-exilic books. These are phrases I've referred to often, but this word refers to the time of the exile, which was roughly 605 to 538. This term refers to events that happened after the exile, which ended in 538. So here's a general outline of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. We see God being faithful. So in the book of Jeremiah, he predicted that God's people would be in exile for 70 years. And in 538 BC, Cyrus made a decree that God's people could go home. You could look up on Wikipedia or on Google just the Cyrus cylinder and see the cuneiform writing of this decree. It's an artifact that we have, and it's also recorded in the book of Ezra as well. So we see that God's people could come home and they could rebuild the temple. They could rebuild the altar, restore the land. So Ezra-Nehemiah is all about God's people coming back home. Namely, God is faithful again. They were exiled because of their sin, but God promised they would come back to the land, and they have come back. Let's see here. Now, specifically, Ezra begins with Cyrus's decree. Here we have it here. It's corresponding to the ministries of Haggai and Zechariah. One of the main leaders is Zerubbabel. He is a descendant from David. He is the governor. He is not a king. And Joshua, who is the high priest. The main idea is reinstating sacrifice and rebuilding the temple, meaning the main idea is to restore proper worship. Here we have a very dynamic plot. The Jews get to go home. They're constructing the temple, but there's opposition to them constructing the temple. The king of Persia halts the effort, but a new king arises and allows them to finish constructing the temple. Here we have the significance of the temple. It was rebuilt in around 520 to 518. Very significant moment because without the temple, you have a disruption to proper worship. So Ezra 1 through 7 is highly significant. Verses 7 through 20 traces Ezra's genealogy and his goal of leading the people well. So what we see here is that God's people have begun to intermarry with people from other religions. We would call this synchronism. Now, this is a big deal because, especially in this context, there is no secularism. There is no context that your religion is yours and my religion is mine, and there is no context that there's like a separation between life and religion. Religion dominated every aspect of life. So synchronism, marrying people of different religions, was akin to disloyalty to God. It meant yoking yourself with another God. And when we read the book of Ezra, what it looks like is not only were these marriages synchronistic, but they also were about divorce. So it seems to be that God's people had divorced their wives, their former wives, and then remarried other women who were in the land, probably to get economic status. You know, there were people living in the land, and when God's people came back, they didn't have farms, they didn't have homes, they didn't have economic status. So for men to divorce their wives and marry these women of standing represented a huge affront to God. And so Ezra is showing us that God's people might have come back from the land, or might have come out of exile, but exile is still very much ingrained into their heart. Nehemiah comes after Ezra, so the temple has been rebuilt. Nehemiah is all about rebuilding the walls. He gets permission to rebuild it, and despite great opposition, he rebuilds the walls. We learn about him being a governor in Israel, and some of the trials he goes through. But we also learn in this book how the people of God read the law and recommit themselves to covenant faithfulness to God, and actually, again, celebrate proper worship before God. So here is Nehemiah's reforms that are all in line with the law. So all that to say, Ezra and Nehemiah are showing us historical events happening in the land of Israel after the exile, showing that God has been faithful to his people. But tragically, his people are not being faithful to God. The final book we're going to cover is Chronicles, which covers the same history as Samuel and Kings, but from a different perspective. You see, Samuel Kings was written to explain why God's people were exiled, and because that was the perspective, the author dealt a lot about sin. They were exiled because of their sin. But Chronicles is written to a discouraged people, a people who don't need to be told why they were exiled. They know why they were exiled. They have the book of Samuel and Kings to read all about it. They need encouragement. So what the author of Chronicles does is he takes historical events from the history of Israel to encourage God's people to be faithful to the Lord. And the entire book ends with Cyrus's decree, which is an announcement and a reminder that God has been faithful to you, so we should be faithful to him. Notice it's not be faithful to God so he is faithful to you, but it's God has been faithful, God has been kind. It's a wooing God's people to covenant faithfulness. But as we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah, we saw that God's people are unfaithful. And that leads us to the New Testament, which we'll pick up next week.